السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا بكم جميعا. معكم فاطمة التركستاني. أشكركم في البداية على وقتكم وحضوركم، وأرحب فيكم في الحلقة الثانية من برنامج سمينار حماية. طبعا أحب أذكر الجميع بأهداف برنامج سمينار حماية، وهو فتح ساحة علمية مثرية للجميع، يجتمع فيها الأكاديميون المتخصصون في مجال الأمن السيبراني. يكون هناك تبادل خبرات، نقاشات، حوارات علمية، وأيضا المجتمع الأكاديمي لحماية يكون أعضاؤه قادرين على عرض أبحاثهم العلمية المنشورة أو مناقشة أفكار وإيجاد فرص بحثية أو فرص للتعاون بين أعضاء المجتمع. وطبعا فيه إضافة أخرى مهمة، وهي أنه هذا السمينار هدفه من أهدافه خلق فرص تمويلية لدعم الأبحاث العلمية من خلال شركاء الجمعية. ضيفتنا اليوم الدكتورة مريم نوح، حاصلة على دكتوراه في الأمن السيبراني من جامعة أكسفورد، وأستاذ مساعد بمدينة الملك عبد العزيز للعلوم والتقنية. أهلا وسهلا فيك دكتورة مريم، شرفتينا.
السلام عليكم
وعليكم
جميعا.
السلام.
شكرا دكتورة فاطمة على التقديم، وأشكر جمعية حماية وحماية الأكاديميين على الدعوة.
حياك الله دكتورة. طبعا اليوم نحن مع الدكتورة راح نناقش يعني عدد من أبحاثها أو عدد من الأبحاث أو مجال بحثها اللي هي أصلا كانت رسالة الدكتوراه. صحيح دكتورة مريم؟
صحيح، هي عبارة عن مجموعة من الستديز اللي عملتها وقت ما كنت في أكسفورد. حأعطيكم نبذة عن بعض الأعمال بإذن الله.
تفضلي يا دكتورة مريم. the floor is yours. تفضلي، الله يحفظك. ما نسمعك
تمام، هل
دكتورة.
العرض
تفضلي
واضح؟
تفضلي. إيه نعم، الحين واضح. تفضلي.
تمام، شكرا. So the talk today will cover different topics related to the area of cybercrime investigations. But before I start, let me introduce myself quickly. I completed my PhD in cybersecurity at University of Oxford. Currently, I'm an assistant professor at CACST in the Center for Complex Systems, which is a research collaboration between CACST and MIT University. I also worked before as a research assistant in the Information Science Institute at University of Southern California back in 2019. I'm also interested in entrepreneurship. So I was lucky to be selected as a participant in the HUD Zero Bootcamp, which is a cybersecurity entrepreneurship bootcamp in London back in 2018. So let's start by going through the outline for the talk today. First, I'll start by giving some introduction on what is cybercrime and discuss the different definition and types of cybercrime and the evolution of cybercrimes over the years. Then I will present three different studies that I worked on while at Oxford. The first one will look at the needs and challenges that cybercrime usually face when investigating cybercrimes. The second part will cover an overview of cybercrime intelligence framework. And finally, we'll look at application on studying cybercriminal communities online. So if we look back at how cybercrime I think from a single virus that was not sophisticated at all, which is the Morris worm virus or Morris worm. It started in '88, and it was one of the first computer worms distributed the internet. Now, it was the first incident that it gained significant media attention, and also first felony conviction under the U.S. Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Different types of threats and attacks were introduced. So Trojans, phishing attack, DNS attacks, moving more towards exploiting using some social engineering tactics, ransomware, and finally we've seen cyber terrorism, cyber. Now we have a wide and the complexity of the attacks significantly increased. If we look, it shows that the damages of the crimes, it cost the world around $1 trillion. And this is a 50% increase from 2018. The same estimated that the cost for the MENA region was around $3.5 billion. The severity and the frequency of these cyber attacks rise as long as are evolved. We saw with the pandemic, people working from home and from remote environments. All of this widely threatens the reach of cybercriminals. Take a step back and we want to look at what is cybercrime. How do you define? So in the literature, الو تسمعوني؟ أعتذر عن شكله صار technical problem. تمام. So if we go back to defining cybercrime, what is cybercrime? Unfortunately, there is no single universal definition, but overall, it covers all digital crimes and traditional crimes that are enhanced through the use of digital technology like computers and networks. The literature, they classified it into three types. So crimes in the machine, crime against the machine, and crime using the machine. For the crime in the machine, it covers concepts of computers. So for example, pornographic material or like child pornography and so on. Crimes against the machine, one example is denial of service attacks. So it covers the attacks that target the integrity of the computers or the networks. And finally, the crime using the machine, which is crimes committed using networked computers, like phishing campaigns, for example. Another popular classification of cybercrimes is the division between computer dependent and enabled, or cyber dependent and cyber enabled crimes. The dependent crimes are crimes that can only be committed using computers and networks. So for example, hacking, malware and ransomware, denial of service attacks, and so on. On the other hand, computer-enabled crimes are traditional crimes that are enhanced either in scale or the reach using computers. So example of this is financial fraud, harassment, bullying, child pornography, for example. So usually they say criminals are one step ahead of police in the race. There are a number of reasons that contribute to that. So for example, the multitude of data that is introduced by the digital aspect of the cyber crimes. For instance, another example is the criminals' advanced technical abilities. So even if the criminal lack the technical knowledge, they can easily purchase different tools through dark web forums and so on. And this is what is called crime as a service. So they have somewhat easy access to the tools that allow them to commit their crime. Another problem is the attribution problem. So cybercrimes tend to have less investigation leads. Mostly in many scenarios, it's difficult for the investigator to attribute who committed that crime. And finally, the globalization feature of cybercrime. So it is unlike traditional crimes where it is bounded by a specific crime scene. Cybercrimes are borderless, cross-jurisdiction. It has a global nature. So on the other hand, if we look at the cybercrime investigators, usually, especially in law enforcement setting, they lack the advanced technical skills and knowledge. Current cybercrime research, especially the one that look at the technical side of the cybercrime, they tend to focus more on proposing new solutions and developing tools that the researchers think that they are useful for cybercrime investigators. However, there is little research that look at the current need and challenges that are actually faced by law enforcement and cybercrime investigators. So we needed to bridge that gap and try to understand more the user perspective or the cybercrime investigator perspective while dealing with cybercrime. This brings me to the first research paper I will cover today that look at this topic. This was published in Usable Security Symposium back in 2019. And it you can see is cybercrime investigators are user two, and we are looking for understanding the source and technical challenges that are faced by law enforcement. So the aim for this research paper is to study the current practices that are followed by cybercrime investigators and try to identify the main characteristics related to the investigation process. We followed a qualitative methodology where we conducted a user study. So first we interviewed a set of experts. We did expert recruitment from both the private sectors and the government sector. The next step was the data gathering. This was done through a combination of questionnaires and semi-structured interviews that lasted between 45 minutes to 1 hour in total. We then analyzed the data we gathered from these user studies by transcribing the interviews and doing coding and selecting the different themes that appeared during the interviews. And finally, we formulate a set of findings in order to identify the challenges and recommendations. So our participants, as I mentioned before, they are from both private and government sectors. Government sector is mainly cybercrime units in different law enforcement agencies at different level, either local level, regional or national level. Private sector are more of like consultancy companies or companies that investigate crimes. The participants had different kinds of roles. So some of them were intelligence analysts, some were cybersecurity officers. We had also cybercrime detectives, officers, and surgeons. We asked them about the different cybercrimes that they have experienced investigated, and the top crimes were cyber fraud, child pornography, ransomware, identity theft, and cyber terrorism. In the analysis of the interviews, we identified three main themes, which are the investigation process. They follow the people aspect, the investigation team, and the technological aspects. For the investigation process, they identified 6 main steps that usually are followed during an intelligence cycle. As you can see in the figure on the right, the first stage is the planning and direction phase. In this step, they focus on identifying the questions that they want to find answers for, and they plan the best course of action to be followed to answer these questions. The second step is the collection step, where they deal with the collection of information and data in order to help them answer the identified questions in the previous step. The third step is the processing and exploitation, which is when the heterogeneous data that is collected from different sources is reformatted into a common format for future analysis, which brings us to the fourth step, where the analysis happen, which is the heart of the intelligence cycle. All the processed data is fit together and connected in order to find answer and produce intelligence. Then we have the dissemination and integration process, where all the analyzed data and the intelligence gathered is shared with the intended stakeholders and people participating in the investigation. And finally, the evaluation and feedback step. And this step is very important because the investigation is always, it doesn't happen once. So they have to take the information and the intelligence they gathered and then either give them more questions to ask or sources of data to collect. So it's an iteratable process. An interesting finding, we found that the people from private sector, they usually tend to follow a top-down approach, meaning they usually have a particular hypothesis, and then they start to collect data and try to prove that hypothesis. On the other hand, people or participants from more government sector, they had a different approach, which is more bottom-up. So they start from the data, they analyze it, and then they try to find, to formulate a hypothesis and a hypothesis of what really happened through the data. An interesting observation from people from law enforcement, they mentioned that cybercrimes and traditional crimes are not very different in their opinion, because they have to use the same detective and investigation tactics. They differ in the globalization of the cybercrime point, but the tactics and skills they use during the investigation can be shared between a cybercrime and traditional crime. واضح صوت؟ Okay, so investigators and analysts do not necessarily come with a previous technical knowledge or background. However, we thought that they would learn in the job the technical skills that they need to perform the investigation. Another observation we found was that information flow between different cybercrime units at different levels. So from a local police force to a regional force to a national force is more challenging. From the technological aspect, we found that in a cybercrime investigation setting, they tend to use different kinds of tools to serve different purposes. However, participants raised the issue that usually there is an interoperability and a problem between these tools. And many of these tools don't really work well together. Another observation was relating to that the structure of how different police forces operate. So they have the freedom to select the system and processes that they follow without being common or mandated to every police force. Of course, this causes a lot of problems in terms of sharing of information and collaboration across forces. When we asked participants about their view around automation and using automated tools that, for example, use machine learning or artificial intelligence and so on, most of them were expressed that these kind of tools are not preferable. This can go back to different reasons, either because lack of the technical skills and the background knowledge of how these tools work. Also, they mentioned that they need to revalidate the results that has been obtained using automated tools, because they need to later on defend their findings in a court setting. So they have to understand how a specific result was reached. However, they also emphasized that automation can be helpful in certain processes, but it always has to be done under a human control and guidance. So bringing us back to the human in the loop aspect. So based on our analysis of the expert interview, we defined 4 levels of framework to better combat cybercrime. From a strategic point of view, from collaboration, people, and finally data and technology. From a strategy point of view, we found that there is a need to review and update the usability and workflow and process of the national reporting system of cybercrimes. The thing is that the current system that was used in the UK was modified from the system that was used to report traditional crimes. So it lacked some of the details that are unique to cybercrimes. Similarly, evaluating the current structure of how law enforcement offices work and studying the effectiveness of their effectiveness to address cybercrimes. So with cybercrime, because it's globalized across jurisdiction, we need more collaboration between different cybercrime units across different regions to be able to share data, connect different cases that happen across different jurisdictions. This bring us to the collaboration aspect. So there is a need to have a centralized coordination of intelligence in multiple levels, like the national and international. So across law enforcement units, across different international agencies like Interpol and Europol and so on. Also, a collaboration is needed between industry and private sectors in order to address the shared cybercrime problems and share intelligence related to different attacks that happens to them. And finally, academia with research and innovation would help in better combating them to address cybercrime. From the people aspect, there is a need of continuous training and improving of the skill set of different agencies. As I mentioned, that we found that most law enforcement who work on cybercrimes don't have the technical, advanced technical ability. Education and awareness campaigns to the community so they don't fall victims to these kind of cybercrime. And finally, providing support to and capacity building to private sector, especially for the small, medium enterprises that they don't have the resources to tackle and address the different attacks that that happen to them. Finally, for the technology aspect, there is a need to have an automation for specific processes, but these, as I mentioned before, should be under the human control and guidance. A study into the interoperability between different tools and systems, and this is to reduce the amount of incompatible tools that are currently being used within the cybercrime investigation units. And finally, tools and workflows should be designed with the usability in mind, making sure that it is suitable for investigators with less technical knowledge. So the second part of this presentation, I'll talk about the cybercrime intelligence framework. So in any crime, you have an offender, and we define an offender as a set of 5 elements. First, you have to understand the motive of that offender. Is it an economic motive? Is it political? Is it related to advancing a specific ideology, or is it just for fun? The second element is the gain. What does that offender hope to gain? Is it money? Perhaps it's data or competitive advantage by a theft of a specific IP, or is it just fame, like more of a reputation? The third element that we need to understand in any cybercrime incident is the type of offender. Was it done by an individual actor, or a group, or an organized crime group? Or was it state-sponsored actor? Now, each of these will have typically have a different kind of resource available to them. So resources the offender has access to in order to commit a crime may include the technical knowledge, or for example, an access to a malicious software or a zero-day vulnerability. Computation power and financial means are all kinds of the resources that define an offender. And finally, the jurisdiction, the jurisdiction that the offender is part of. This will help in coordinating with other cybercrime units, either locally, regionally, or globally. So an offender commits an incident. Now, the incident can be defined by 4 elements. What is the type of that incident? Is it a cyber-enabled, like a fraud, or it's a cyber-dependent crime, like a specific intrusion or hacking into a system or a network? Also, the MO, the method that was used to commit that incident. So description of the method used in the offense and how the incident occurred is understanding that is very important. So for example, was it through a certain phishing campaign that led to a malware infection? Or for example, what type of malware have been used? What vulnerabilities were exploited? And what are the tools that has been used? Identifying the method and the MO will aid investigators to better understand the incident and identify MO patterns, and that may lead to profile cyber criminals. So they may know who did that because of a similar MO method that was used in another case, for instance. The scale. So what is the scale of the incident and the level of impact it caused? This is in terms of the frequency of the incident and urgency of the situation. For example, is it an ongoing incident, or is it a specific attack that happened and it stopped? The number of victims that were affected by that incident as well. And finally, the investigation leads. What are the types of available investigation leads and verifiable information related to the incident that the investigator has access to. Of course, the incident will affect a victim, and we need to understand the types of the victim. So the victim may be an individual who has fallen a victim to the cybercrime, or it might be an enterprise that is, for example, a large enterprise or a small to medium enterprise. Having that distinction is important as well during the investigation process. So small, medium enterprises, they will typically need more assistance in dealing with the aftermath of the crime because of the limited resources they may have. However, a large enterprise usually are more capable of handling and overcoming the effects of the incident through the having proper processes and procedures in place. Also, victims may be government entities, or it might be the public, the general public. All of these need to be identified in order to lead how the investigation and the urgency of the investigation will be. The second element that is important is the jurisdiction. Again, where is the victim located? This also helps with coordination with different cybercrime units locally and globally. And finally, the harm. What type of harm happened in that incident? So harms can be broken down into 4 types. It can be an economic loss. So what is the amount of loss occurred during that particular incident? It can be measured directly of or indirectly, like loss of availability of the service because of the attack, like a denial of service attack. The second type of harm is either digital or a physical asset. So loss of data or IP or abuse of resources, such as the computation power of the entity, of the victim. The level of the loss of damage caused. So for example, if the victim can restore from a recent backup, then this would be a small loss. But if the victim lost an IP related data, it would be a high loss for them. The third type is the political harm. This type of loss include, for example, losing geopolitical power, or for example, damaging relationships with other nations, or as we heard some rumors about disturbance of election process, and in general, loss of the political influence on the public. Finally, the psychological harm. This type of loss causes either emotional or cognitive disturbance, for example, feeling of depression, anxiety, spread of fear in the general public, or self-harm, for instance. This can be manifested in cybercrimes that target the human, such as cyberbullying, cyberstalking, or online radicalization. So a considerable amount of research has focused on the studying of the cybercrimes that target networks and systems, like studying malware, distributed denial of service, cyber fraud, and so on. But in the recent years, we saw different kinds of threats that target and manipulate people. So these, for example, may include the use of online resources to manipulate the public opinion, hate crime, cyberbullying and trolling, spreading of fake news and misinformation, and finally the spread of violent and extremist content and behavior. Now, this brings me back to the third part of the presentation that actually look at the threat of online spread of violent extremist content. We have seen in the last years that several extremist groups utilize the social media to widen their reach. This has given them media to broadcast their ideology and spread fear and recruit members of the public to join them. As we can see from the figure, for instance, on Twitter, there has been an increase in the number of accounts, and Twitter has been acting media platform working to limit such use or abuse of their platform by blocking and suspending the identified extremist accounts. Also, we have seen in 2010, there was an incident, an attack in New Zealand, in Christchurch, where the attacker published a manifesto, a report online hours before the attack, explaining what he's planning to do and his motives and so on. Even he went further that he also used the live streaming feature of some social media platforms to stream his. So all of this brings a lot of concern, especially for social media platforms, in order to limit such a plan by extremist groups. If we go and at the layer of terrorism, cyber terrorism, find they classify the actions based on two elements: the target and the method. So as you can see from the figure, targets can be cognitive, for example, the mind of people or the ideology and the beliefs of it. It can be virtual targets, sources in the cyberspace, or it can be physical things that is connected to the cyber world, for example. The method can be to attack targets, can be either an enabling, disruptive, or destructive. So if we look at the bubble on the lower left corner, which is the enabling and cognitive, this one, for instance, what falls under it is the different tactics to recruit, train, and radicalize communities. In the remaining of this talk, I will focus on this particular sphere. So many of the extremist groups are now using online magazines and publishing in order to spread their ideology and propaganda and recruit people to their group. So in the research goes to identify what are principles that we can utilize to automatically detect activities during this enabling phase, which is the online radicalization. And how can we detect on content and behavior? Some of these techniques, I'll go over it quickly here. It can be either, if we are talking about identifying be word level or psychological level.
تسمعيني دكتورة؟ أهلا دكتورة، تسمعيني الآن؟ عذرا انقطع الاتصال مع الدكتورة، بس واضح أنها عاودت الدخول مرة أخرى. دكتورة ما نسمعك الآن. نعتذر عن هذا الخلل. إن شاء الله الدكتورة مريم بتكون معنا في غضون ثواني. دكتورة؟
ألو؟
أيوة دكتورة نسمعك الآن، تفضلي.
تمام، المعذرة. Sorry, I don't know. The network is really bad today. Okay, so I was talking about the different levels of analysis that we can do on the radical content. So the first level is the word level analysis, where we identify the keywords that are important in the content. The next level is the context. So they say the content is, if the content is king, then understanding context is queen. So it is very important to understand the context that these words appear in. And finally, we'll look at methods that can help us understand the psychological characteristic behind the different text, which is the psycholinguistic analysis. So the first level of analysis is the word level. One approach to identify the important or keywords in a given text is using the TF-IDF, term frequency inverse document frequency. It's a numerical statistic that is intended to reflect the important words in a document. So to achieve this, we do a very simple process. First, we clean the text by removing punctuation and stop words and so on. We then convert the text into bag of words, do lemmatization in order to remove any inflections and endings of the word and bring words back to its roots. And finally, we extract unigrams, bigrams, and trigrams and calculate the TF-IDF weight for each of these grams. At the end of this process, each article will be converted into a set of grams, where grams with high weight mean that they are more important to the given article in our dataset. The second type of analysis that we will look at is the extracting the context. And we do this using word embedding models. In this approach, we represent every word in our corpus by a vector. Usually, vector capture hidden information about the language, such as word analogies and semantic aspects. So as you can see from the figure, this is a very popular example that's usually used in word embedding. So you have an input 3 words, king, man, and a woman. You input this into a word-to-vec model, which is a statistical method developed by Google in order to learn the different word embeddings from the corpus. And each word is transferred into a vector with different values. After doing this process to all words, you will get a collection of vectors, each vector representing a word. And the nice thing that's provided by word embedding is that you can actually do meaningful operation on these vectors. So for example, if you do king minus man plus woman, which is semantically it should equal to queen, you can find that the vectors for the operation and the queen vector is fairly similar. So if we try to visualize these vectors, we find that similar words do cluster together. So this shows that it can preserve the semantic, the meaning of the word. So for example, in that scenario, the country capital, we find that names of countries clusters in one side, names of their cities and capital cluster on the other side. So we apply this approach on the radical magazines that we have in our corpus. And we build a radical model that can capture the semantic meanings and the relation of different words that are used in these extremist magazines. We then, using these vectors, we build a semantic network of the different words in the corpus, such that each word is connected to the words that are close to it in the vector space. So for example, if we query, after building the model, if we query the model and give it an input, for example, the word kuffar, and we ask the model to return the most similar words to it. So in that instance, for example, it returns weak, bawaghit, secular. So it gives you sort of an understanding of what different words or concepts mean in that particular ideology. And you can use that model to query different kinds of words, and then you get what this corpus or ideology think of that particular word. The third type of analysis is the psycholinguistic analysis. So usually words, the choices of words that we make in our daily communication, these are signals that can detect our emotional states. And research in linguistic and psychology, they found different links between what kinds of choices of words we make and different symptoms like depression, suicide, and anxiety, and so on. So in this approach, we count the frequencies of words that occur in the text and map them into a set of predefined categories. So for example, emotional categories like anger or fear, categories related to social interests like family, friends, religion, also other cognitive processes like certainty, tentativeness, and so on. There are different kinds of tools that help in achieving this, like Look, which is linguistic inquiry and word count, and Empath, and there are others. Combining the different categories together can give us a picture of the author or the writer of the text, their interest, their personality, their emotional states as they conveyed through that text. So we applied this method on our extremist magazine's dataset. And the result of the analysis, we found that, for example, the text expressed strong emotions, both from a positive and a negative emotional side. For the negative emotions, we found that anger was the most prevalent emotion in the magazines, in the corpus. Also, there was a big focus on the power element, which is one of the most expressed drive in the text. This actually can be linked to the purpose of these magazines, as the main purpose is to advertise their strength and recruit and attract individuals to join them. So it is understandable that the focus is mainly on the power element. Other traits that we found were strong in the text include, for example, persuasiveness, aggression, assertiveness as well. All of these help these groups attract people in order to convince them with their ideology and recruit them. So we used this sort of analytical technique in a system where we Hello?
نسمعك دكتورة تفضلي.
تمام. So we used the models that we trained on the extremist propaganda, and we developed a system to detect radical content on Twitter. If you are interested to know more details on that particular study, you can check the paper cited here. But basically, the process is that we give it a set of tweets. Some are normal tweets and other are pro-extremist tweets. The system consists of three main steps: the data pre-processing, the feature mining, and finally the classification and validation. In the feature mining, we perform extract three kinds of features using the different methods that I described. So we utilize the radical corpus that was trained on the Radical magazine, the model, the word embedding model. We utilize the radical psychological profile that was extracted using the different psycholinguistic categories. And we also build some interaction network model in order to capture the behavioral aspect of how users behave on Twitter. As I mentioned, you can find more details on the paper for like a further read. I think this concludes my talk today. I tried to give a quick overview of three different angles of the study into the world of cybercrime investigation and online radicalization. If you have any sort of questions or if you are interested in research in any of these areas, feel free to contact me either on Twitter or through my website, and I'll be happy to talk further. Thank you so much, and I'm so sorry for the constant interruption of the internet.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Mariam, for this great session and your contribution in this area. And we greatly appreciate your time and effort, and we are glad to have you today with us in Himaya seminar. I would leave the floor now for the audience. If you have any questions, please you can text any of the host or co-host. I would like also to thank the audience for their time. يعطيكم ألف عافية وشكرا جزيلا على حضوركم. بانتظار أسئلة أو مشاركات أو مداخلات للدكتورة. أتوقع أنه عندنا سؤال من منيرة الوهيبي. مرحبا منيرة، كيف حالك؟
الحمد لله. يعطيكم العافية ويعطي الأستاذة مريم ألف عافية. الفكرة جدا جميلة، بس كنت بسأل عن التريننج. هي قالت إنه استخدمنا مجلات حقت الإكستريمست عشان يسوون المودلز. فبس كان عندي سؤال إنه المجلات اللي حطوها هل هي مثلا تبع certain type of extremists like for example Islamic extremist، أو كانت مغطية extremists من different يعني areas، يعني مثلا white supremacy مثلا، في يعني all kind of extremists. فهل هي يعني ركزت على نوع واحد أو على عدة أنواع، وهل يفرق؟ هل في اختلاف مثلا؟ هل مثلا الإسلامك extremist عندهم مثلا features مختلفة عن غيرهم مثلا، أو كل الextremists عندهم the same use of language, the same emotions and everything؟ ويعطيكم العافية.
شكرا منيرة. تفضلي دكتورة.
شكرا منيرة على السؤال. Very important question. For research, I cover different kinds of extremist group. يعني بعضهم related to Islamist extremists and also right-wing and white supremacists. One of the interesting things that we found في comparison between the analysis اللي done على different extremist groups is that there are a lot of similarities. طبعا differences موجودة in the way in the source of the extremism. فمثلا groups like ISIS ولا القاعدة they tend to use religion as their source of motive, while for example the white supremacists focus more on the race. But if we go a little bit deeper into like looking at their emotions and looking at, for example, the way of the language that they use, for instance, the in-group, out-group tactic, which is مثلا talking about us versus them, this sort of alienation of the other. Both groups had a similar approach. So all of them had a clear distinction between us and them. Like they always talk about two different groups. They focus on emotion a lot, both positive and negative. I'm talking both groups. Also, one of the main similarities is the power. So they all try to show power in their the way they talk and spread their propaganda material. ففي الأخير يعني our conclusion كانت واحدة منها إنه extremism, regardless of its source, they have very common or similar ways or tactics.
جريت، يعطيك العافية. ما أدري الأودينس عندهم سؤال ثاني للدكتورة. الدكتورة بالمناسبة I would like to ask هل هذا نفس يعني هل عندك مجالات أخرى بحثية أنت مهتمة فيها غير الموضوع هذا؟ نعرف أحيانا بعد الدكتوراه يصير التوجه أحيانا لمجالات مختلفة غير بحث الدكتوراه، فودي أستغل الفرصة وأعرف اهتماماتك البحثية. الله يحفظك.
صحيح. يعني other areas I'm interested in في الفترة هذه مثلا موضوع misinformation with disinformation. So the spread of fake news أو misinformation online. ممكن يعني it's a little bit similar للاريا اللي أنا كنت شغالة عليها، لكن from another perspective. فمثلا during COVID حاليا انتشرت كثير مثلا من الشائعات بخصوص أشياء لها علاقة بالمرض نفسه، طرق الوقاية and so on. we found إنه a lot of يعني هذه الشائعات أدت إنه يصير في تهاون مثلا في إنه الناس to follow recommendation حقت منظمة الصحة ولا وزارة الصحة هنا في السعودية and so on. فانتشار الشائعات خلال مثلا البانديميك هذه واحدة من الأشياء اللي I'm interested to study it وأشوف how we can detect it أو counter it. يعني what is the best way to stop هذا الانتشار.
صح، جريت، صح. هو صراحة فترة الجائحة صارت فيه كثير من الأمور المستجدات وصارت فيه مواضيع بحثية كثيرة نحن كباحثين ممكن نتطرق لها ونبحث فيها، وصح هذه واحدة من الأشياء المهمة. فممتاز، هذه الانترست إضافية للدكتورة مريم. إن شاء الله في حال حب منكم أحد تواصل مع الدكتورة أو المشاركة أكيد هي على استعداد للتعاون معكم إن شاء الله. في سؤال
آخر دكتورة.
الله يعطيك ألف عافية، شكرا جزيلا دكتورة على وقتك. عندنا سؤال من رشيد. السلام عليكم. وعليكم السلام، أهلا وسهلا رشيد، كيف حالك؟
الحمد لله الحمد لله. فقط سؤال عن دراسات ممكن يعني نقدر نحصل عليها بخصوص تجريم أو وضع المسؤولية على منصات التواصل الاجتماعي إلى السايبر أتاكس أو الميس انفورميشن مثل ما حصل في الانتخابات الأمريكية.
عفوا معلش تعيد السؤال لأن كان يقطع شوية الصوت.
كان يسأل بخصوص تجريم راشد معانا.
أيوة نعم
تفضل عشان الدكتور يناقشك.
بس للإيضاح معلومات عن تجريم أو وضع المسؤولية على منصات التواصل الاجتماعي لنشر المعلومات الخاطئة أو مثلا الأخبار التابعة للمجموعات الإرهابية.
تمام. الصراحة يعني هذا الموضوع شوية يعني it's an area of research و debate في الفيلد إنه مين عنده المسؤولية. هل هي منصات التواصل الاجتماعي هي اللي تتحمل مسؤولية نشر هذه المعلومات، ولا المسؤولية لا تقع عليها؟ لأنه في الأخير هي مثلا لها connection مع freedom of speech، فيعني هو will decide what kind of information أو speech is approved and what kind of speech is not approved أو is banned. طبعا في أشياء it's clear cut، يعني anything that call for violence ولا violent behavior هذه ما فيها شك إنه أكيد يتم منعها، لكن في أشياء اللي on the gray side so it's subjective different يعني تحتمل التأويل. من ناحية الريسيرش في هذه الاريا من الليجل aspect، هذه very interesting research area that people I know a lot of people interested in. And how do you legalize it? This is another kind of research that I'm not expert in, but definitely it's something of interest. And how do you formulate a legal framework for this kind of behavior? خاصة إنه all of this technology, the social media and spread حقها, it's something new that the current legal system need to update and to follow up on it.
صحيح. طبعا احنا طبعا الجميع اكيد عارف عن نظام مكافحة الجرائم المعلوماتية اللي صدر مرسوم ملكي، لكن مثل ما ذكرت الدكتورة مريم أحيانا في مستجدات ويصير فيه بالذات السايبر كرايم لو والتقاطع بين اللو والسايبر سيكيورتي هو فعلا محل دراسة. يعطيكم العافية. في سؤال آخر، هل يوجد بين النص في المجلات مختلف عن نصوص التغريدات؟ بمعنى هل يمكن استخدام المجلات لتدريب النموذج ومن ثم استخدام ذات النموذج لتصنيف التغريدات؟ واضح السؤال ولا أسوي أنميوت لمنيرة مرة ثانية دكتورة؟
واضح السؤال. بالنسبة للموديل هو was trained على المجلات، بس بعد ما تم زي ما شرحت في البرزنتيشن إنه عملنا different kind of steps of pre-processing على أساس نرجع الwords ل its roots. طبعا شيء I have to mention here إنه كان الموديل فقط على اللغة الإنجليزية، ما كان على العربي. فنفس البري بروسيسنج ستيب حصلت على التويتات. طبعا كان في a lot of noise لأن the way people write في تويتر أحيانا
صحيح.
تكون السبيلينج شوية خطأ،
ولهجات عامية.
Exactly. فحصل يعني كان في part of the process some of the mapping of some of the words and pre-processing للكلمات.
دكتورة
بالنسبة
natural processing language.
yes نعم.
أوكي.
واحد من الأسئلة كمان أتوقع كان عن دقة النموذج.
صحيح.
So we did a different kind of experiments على different data sets. بس الرينج of الدقة كانت in the 90-95%.
الدكتورة بالنسبة للموديل is it for Twitter only or يعني it could be or it could be adapted to other social media أو في الإكسبيرمنت نفسها أنت استخدمتيه عشان شيء غير تويتر؟
الموديل استعملناه بس على تويتر، لكن it can be easily adopted على other kinds of social media platforms as long as إنه يعني it has the same concept. يعني مثلا في تويتر you have the text, you have the interaction. You can map it to Facebook مثلا اللي هو البوست واللايكس والكذا. We did it only on Twitter, but it can be adopted to other social media.
Great. الله يعطيك العافية. شكرا لك دكتورة، وشكرا للجميع على أسئلتهم وتفاعلهم وعلى حضورهم، وإن شاء الله ندعو الجميع للمشاركة معنا إن شاء الله في الحلقات القادمة. اللي حاب يشارك في سمينار حماية يعني he or she is more than welcome. شكرا جزيلا دكتورة مريم على وقتك، ويعطيك ألف عافية، ونلقاك إن شاء الله في لقاءات قريبة وأبحاث قريبة إن شاء الله.
بإذن الله. يعطيك ألف عافية دكتورة فاطمة، وشكرا لحماية على الاستضافة، ومرة تانية أعتذر على التكنيكال difficulties اللي صارت، بس الحمد لله يعني we managed.
لا ولا يهمك، ألف شكر، يعطيكم ألف عافية. الكونتاكت لدكتورة مريم موجود تويتر، وأيضا كمان يعني أتوقع رقم الجوال حيكون موجود في حماية إذا حبيت تتواصلوا مع الدكتورة وتصير فيه فرص علمية أو تعاون بحثي بينكم. فنتمنى للجميع التوفيق ويعطيكم ألف عافية.